Hi, today I'm here to show you how to put some of our sections of our quilt together. We're in the home stretch, we're almost done putting it together. And in November, we're making a partial seam. Now that might sound scary to some of you, you're like, oh, I don't want to know how to do that, but it's easy and it's going to make a big difference in the quilt. I use partial seams a lot when I'm making t-shirt quilts because it avoids having a seam that runs straight through top to bottom or left to right of your quilt when you're putting your parts together. So a partial seam will help avoid having that single seam dividing your quilt into sections. So if you look down here, you'll see that we have an October section 1, October section 2 that you made last month, September section 1, September section 2 that you made in September. And way back in April, we made a little tiny section, and that's where our partial seam is going to come in because we have to put these 5 sections together to make the body of our quilt. So what you're going to do is you're going to fit these pieces together, and you'll see the October section is going to go above the April section, and that's where we're going to sew a partial seam, and it just means we're going to sew part of that line, not the whole thing to start with. After we do that, we're going to sew in our September section 2, and that will be a complete seam. Then we'll sew October section 1, another complete seam. And then here, we've got this started but not fully sewn. We're going to bring in September section 1 and sew a straight line down there, and that will fit right in. And then we will finish the top seam to complete our quilt. Paper isn't as good as quilts. There we go. And we'll have our whole center together, and then we'll just have our borders to finish after this. The first step is to take October section 2 and April. The April section is going to go below the October section 2. Make sure you have it lined up the way it is in the picture. And we're going to flip this up so we can sew our seam right sides together. And I'm just going to put a couple pins. You want to line up the corner. And a couple pins. Pinning is going to be important on these steps just to hold them in place while you're getting to your sewing machine. Okay, I have that pinned. Now we're going to go over to my sewing machine, and I'm not going to start at the end and sew the whole thing. I'm going to start about halfway and sew that partial seam. I have my April section on the bottom and my October section on the top. And if you see it starts here, I don't want to start there sewing. I'm going to start near the white pin and sew to the edge of the quilt. Use your accurate 1/4 inch seam. That's important. You want all your pieces to line up and fit in the end. And don't sew through your pins. And sew right to the end. And if you look at that, you'll see, I'm going to remove that other pin so you can see. You'll see it's sewn from the center to the corner, but this side over here is not sewn, and we will sew that later. Now we're adding September section 2 to the side of the unit we just sewed. I pressed my seam towards the April section. And don't press where it's not sewn yet, just press the part that's sewn so we have a flat spot to work with. And it's getting big now, but you're going to take your September section, make sure it's the right direction, and then flip it on top of the one you just did so it's right sides together, and it should line up corner to corner across here. If you need to stretch a little or pull a little to make it line up, you can do that. And then you're just going to pin across that whole side to keep it lined up for you. And I like to pin my 2 ends in case there's any easing that needs to be done. So I start by pinning the 2 ends. And then if you have a large place to work on top of a bed or on the floor, my cutting table's getting a little too small now for this quilt. And then just put enough pins in to hold it in place. About every 6 or 8 inches is good. And then you'll bring that to your sewing machine and sew that whole line from end to end. Next, you're going to add the October section 1 below April and September. The October 2 is sticking off on the side. So I have mine laid out here, and here's my new section being added. It's going to go right at the bottom below there. So I'm going to fold it up on top. Use your big kitchen table, your bed, somewhere where you can spread it out nice and stretch it across into place. And there you go. And then you'll want to pin, starting at the corners. Give it a little stretch if you need to ease in, and match them up. And I like to pin the middle. And at least 2 more pins. You could go a couple more if you wanted to. And then you'll bring that over to your sewing machine and sew a line completely across to connect those 2 pieces. Now we're going to add the last section, September section 1, and we're going to do 2 seams. The first seam, this one's not attached all the way, the first one has a partial seam, is just going to fit right in from top to bottom next to the other 2. So let's do that. It's getting really big, so you definitely need a big place to work. I have my quilt here, and I'm going to scooch it up because I'm going to pin to this piece. And it's going to go in like this. That section you have over here is the corner that's poking in there, so make sure you have it the right direction. Flip it right sides together. I'm going to move that first section out of the way, and I'm just going to pin it starting here all the way down. Just a little tip, if you find when you're sewing one piece is a little longer than the other and you have to do some easing in, make sure the longer piece is on the bottom going by your feed dogs, because that will help ease it in better. And I'm just going to put pins every 6 to 8 inches across that seam. Pinning is important. Don't skip the pinning step. You want your pieces to fit. If your seam allowances were good, they'll line up nicely. If you had them all the right size as you made each one. If not, you're going to need to stretch a little bit to make them fit. Make sure they go together. And then you'll bring this over to your machine and sew it in. And just a little tip, if it's getting big and bulky, that's the seam we're going to sew over here, so you can just roll in the extra stuff out of your way to keep that seam open. And then when you sew, it's easier to handle just across that seam. Now we're going to finish the seam that started as a partial seam. Our April section is here, and this is the section we started with, October section 2, and they have a partial seam holding them together. And the one we just sewed in is going to fit in the place between the partial seam and connect it and make it all one piece. So I'm going to take my whole area here and I'm going to flip it over. So those 2 seams are right sides together. And it starts at our partial seam right here. And we're going to finish that last seam. So I'm going to line it up and I'm going to pin to hold those in place, starting where the partial seam is and going all the way across so they line up nicely over here. Add a few pins to hold it all in place. Did you notice there aren't a lot of points to match? You do have to watch about cutting off your points, but you're not lining them up and matching them because the stars are floating in the background, which makes it a little bit easier for piecing, so you don't have to think about that. All right, I have that pinned. We're gonna go over to my sewing machine and I'm gonna show you, we're gonna start sewing at the partial seam that's already sewn, or start here and work our way to the outside edge. Now you're going to start sewing. Where this partial seam ends, you can overlap it a little bit if you need to. Put your presser foot right on it. I have the bulk of the quilt up on my table, so the weight of it isn't gonna slow me down and pull and drag and catch and cause problems. So I have the weight up on the table. I'm gonna make sure they're lined up across the seams. And you're just gonna sew with your 1/4 inch seam across that seam, starting in the middle, working your way out. Take your time. And now I just need to, because the bulk's on the table, straighten it out, keep it from hanging and pulling. Sew as far as you can each time, and then adjust your quilt to make it easy to feed. I've got a little seam there, I'm going to flatten it. Stop before you hit any pins. Take your time. And we're almost to the corner. And that seam finishes the center section of your quilt, which goes like that. Bring it to your iron, press that seam, finish the pressing, and then you're done.